All right, and we are ready to begin, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us, especially to our panelists. I'm very excited to have this webinar today on a topic of great interest to all of our readers, which is China-Africa relations, and we are joined by three stellar experts. We have Abdul Ghaffar Toby Oshodi, who is a political science lecturer at the Lagos State University in Nigeria. Sorry, I'm still waking up this morning. Thank you for joining us, Toby. And we also have Hannah Ryder, who is the CEO of Development Reimagined, which is an international development consultancy in China that has a special focus on China-Africa relations and business. So thank you, Hannah, for joining us as well. It's a late evening for you over in Asia. And then we have Bob Wakesa, who is a research partnership and communications coordinator at the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in South Africa. But that title might not clue you in that he also focuses on Africa-China relations and the way that intersects with the United States approach to Africa. So thank you, Bob, for joining us as well. I'm very excited to have all three of you. Toby is going to be starting off our discussion. We hear a lot, particularly in international media, about China's role in Africa. Is it a neo-colonialist power? Is it a predatory lender that seeks to entrap countries in a debt trap? Is it predominantly racist that mistreats Africans in China and even in their own home countries? And then China says it's a win-win partner, that it is a strong brother and friend to Africa. But Toby is going to talk to us about how Africans think about this relationship. What are their concerns? What do they like about China? What are they worried about in terms of the relationship? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, Toby.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And I think you actually almost completed my presentation. You made my presentation easy with all those talking points you mentioned. Thank you for inviting me to the presentation. And I'm also happy to be on the panel with Anna and Bob. But I think I will start with, a quote from one of the experts, on China-Africa relations, Africa-China relations. And he noted that China in Africa is perhaps the most momentous event since the Cold War. And you need to reflect about that short quote, that China in Africa is, probably the most important thing after the Cold War. And, to wrap your, head around it, beyond Tazara, is this railway that links Tanzania to Zambia. Shannon, am I audible? Can you? Okay. Tazara links Tanzania to Zambia. That used to be the landmark infrastructural, manifestation of China on the continent. But as we speak today, not only is the African Union Secretariat built by China as early as 2012, but of course, the ECOWAS, Secretariat would also be built by China. And that is in spite of the fact that 2018, after the Secretariat was built in 2012, 2018, there was this bad press about Chinese spying on the African leaders, in the AU Secretariat. But in spite of that, China is still building the African Union, the ECOWAS Secretariat. You know what? Even as we speak today, December last year, China, there was the groundbreaking for the Africa, CDC. We're talking about COVID now, but China is building the secretariat, the new secretariat for Africa CDC. And that already gives you an idea of, some of the talking points on the continent. But I need to quickly just clear, the table by, briefly talking about two things. One, yes, I'll be talking about African perspective on China. But of course, we need to remind ourselves, like the late Pius Adesomi reminded us, that Africa is not a country. So when we talk about African perspective, we need to have at the back of our mind that, of course, there are different types of Africa. For instance, 2012, when in Zambia, King Cobra, Michael Sata came into power riding on this anti-Chinese sentiment. 2 years after China was building the African Union Secretariat that I talked about, and the King Cobra had to attend AU meetings, in that. So that's just to give you a context that, yes, we talk about Africa, but there are different layers of complexities. Then the other thing is African perspective. We need to see it from, there's the thick and the thin dimension. The thick, or the thin aspect, talks about African perspective on China in terms of what China is doing on the continent. But the thick approach to this talks about other dimensions. And I will explain that from 2009 to 2000 until date. I locate my three realities. One, Chinese domestica. Chinese domestica means if you want to understand what China is doing on the continent or how Africans perceive China, you need to understand what is happening within China itself. And recently, the Guangzhou, experience that you alluded to, when, it was in the news that Africans were being maltreated, speaks to this idea of the ordinary Chinese-Africa relations, what happens in China. Then, of course, there's the Chinese international, which is what China is doing outside of being a responsive Taiwan question. These are also things that Africans have their own perception about, the Taiwan question and the rest of it. But of course, Chinese domestica, so one question. But of course, Chinese domestica, which is the popular, approach to discussing African perspective on China, looks at what China is doing within the continent. And there are, mainly, I'm looking at my time, there are mainly three dimensions or three perspectives. One is the this Sino-pessimism. The second is Sino-optimism. And the third is the cautious group, people that stand in between the two extremes. And Sino-optimism, straightforward. From all these infrastructural projects, you get into certain African countries, from the airport to the road you drive on, to the railway you take, being built by China. If you travel to Nigeria, for instance, the airport is being, refurbished by China. The roads, many roads are being constructed by China. The railway, mainly constructed by China. So already you see what African leaders, when people like Abdoulaye Wade said, it was more useful, for you to negotiate, discuss, and sign agreement with the World Bank could take as long as 5 years. But his hotel meeting with Hu Jintao, just 1 hour hotel meeting, in the executive suite of his own hotel, was by far more useful than the G8 summit he attended. And we need to understand what he said, that a 1 hour meeting was by far more useful than the G8 summit. So when people reflect about Africa, they talk about, when people reflect about China on the continent, they talk in terms of the infrastructure, the constructions that is being, undertaken by China. And that was, of course, when I say infrastructure, there is the hard dimension, which is the roads, the railways, the airport, and the rest of it. But increasingly, there is the soft dimension, which is what China seems to be mastering now. As we speak, we have Africans studying, in Chinese universities and coming back, to take charge. In fact, if it may interest our listeners, today as we speak, the chief of naval staff in Nigeria was trained in China. Think about it. So not only is China teaching your students, people are coming back to assume leadership position. So, and what do you expect Africa? How should Africans, visualize China when China is investing in such, kind of training? So the Sino-optimists see China as this friendly nation that is trying to support it in its, not only the hard infrastructural development, but the soft component of it. 2014, we were shocked that more people, more students, more African students study in China than in the US, than in the UK. That is also, but again, we also, if we also look at the polls in terms of how Africans, for instance, perceive China. Many of them, see whether you talk about the BBC polls, the Afro barometer, you talk about, the one conducted by, I think, the University of Maryland, Piper, they have this, yes, their favorite of the win-win that the Chinese government is also, so the idea of win-win is not only, is being accepted by a lot of actors, state actors, of course, state actors, because they need support, the Chinese development finance for their own project, but of course, non-state actors too, they're beginning to support. But that is not the only narrative, because just as you have the dragon's gift, you also know that the dragon has a claw, and the claw can also be dangerous. And that brings me to the, Sino-pessimism, and you already mentioned the, the CCT, the Chinese colonialism thesis, which is, this idea that China is invading the continent, taking natural resources for whatever, in the process, deepening dependence, because so majority of the, items taken to China are unprocessed. And if we agree that the trade between China and Africa has galloped from, less than 10 billion, 1999, to 200 billion, 2015. And some people, if not for COVID, some people were expecting as close to 350 and $400 billion in trade in 2020, but that has not happened. So people talk about that, so, but that it is deepening dependence rather than promoting the development of the continent. Of course, they also talk about the nascent, the young companies in Africa. Lee, eloquently argued that how will the African nascent industries compete with the Chinese importation? How? And he cited the example of a shoe company, for instance, in China, making shoes for $5. If you buy in bulk, if you buy 5, you pay $3. But the Zimbabwean, shoemaker can only sell and make profit if he sells for $25. So what happens to him? And again, in Nigeria, where I stay, you notice what happened in terms of the protest against the textile, Chinese textile importation. Where people were saying, no, this is killing us, we are becoming, and if you look at the decline of the Nigerian textile industry, it also almost coincides, with this open border of, Chinese importation, textile importation. So the textile factories are dying in Nigeria, in a country like Nigeria, for instance, but Chinese textiles are moving in, so people are also talking about that. Of course, a colleague talked about the Chinko economy. People are also wary. Yes, we get a lot of Chinese phone, Chinese technology, but people are also worried about, are these counterfeit, adulterated, or substandard products? Cars, are these cars products, for instance? Of course, we know that even if you have your Apple phone, the component is made from China. So that is actually a question of specification, specs. But of course, people are also discussing that. Then, of course, Guangzhou, the racial question. And last year, bring that to the front burner in Africa-China relations, where Africans were maltreated, and you can imagine the outburst of anger in Africa on the social media and also in the news media, where people were very critical of the friendship, the win-win, public, the public win-win discourse of China and what was happening in China. Of course, racism has also always been an issue in terms of the blacks in Africa, but Guangzhou just brought it to the fore and people actually discussed it, and the Chinese ambassadors in many African countries were invited to discuss. Then, of course, the debt trap. It has happened before. Africans are not just saying, no, there's a chance, there could be a chance for this loan. When you get loan and you can't pay after some time, it becomes a problem to you. It has happened. we had the situation on the continent where African countries, they actually took loans from the Bretton Woods institutions, at some point couldn't pay up. And that became a problem where they used money that would have been meant for, developing their society, addressing some fundamental, problems, being spent servicing debt. So Africans are worried about that. And that actually became, sometimes that is instrumentalized for political reasons in parliament. Nigeria had its own share, where parliamentarians, opposition parliamentarians were raising the point that how can we sustain these increasing loans? And that became, an issue. Of course, I've mentioned dependence, and I'm looking at my time, it's almost, I've mentioned dependence, that it has happened before, even from the colonial economy, when your economy is structured in such a way that you produce raw materials, you send it out unprocessed. It is historical, it has happened. So Africans are actually, concerned. But in conclusion, I must also, having said all this, I must also draw attention to the problematics of what I've discussed now, in the sense that the Africa-China perception is not something that is static. It is oscillation. It is oscillating. It is changing. It is dynamic. You see a country today doing something with China, tomorrow it is not. The oil for infrastructure happened in Nigeria, but the next administration from the same political party canceled that and reversed. Then, of course, we also need to unpack, when we say perception, do we mean the political elite? Do we mean the intellectuals? Do we mean the media? And I think Bob is in the best position to talk about our mediated understanding of Africa-China relations. So I think I'll just stop there and allow Anna and Bob to.
Thank you, Toby. You had a difficult task to give us an overview of China-Africa relations, as you pointed out, that encompasses a lot of layers, from the optimist to the pessimist, everything in between. So thank you for that comprehensive overview. There's plenty to discuss in the Q&A. And Hannah is going to talk about an issue of particular interest, especially to the international media, which is the China debt question, which obviously in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, there have been many calls for China to restructure this debt, maybe even forgive loans. So Hannah, if you could just tell us, how are governments in Africa and the publics in Africa viewing these loans, especially now?
Thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me on this discussion. And it's great to follow an overview, because that really sets the tone for what we're discussing here. Very much in terms of an African perspective, how are these things playing out? What do they really mean? I want to begin. What I always begin when we're talking about debt, I always begin in one place, and Shannon knows this, because when I write, this is what I do. I usually begin with talking about financial needs going forwards. So when we talk about debt, we need to remember that for the African continent, the majority of countries do need more debt going forwards in some shape or form. We have the estimate from the African Development Bank, which says, which was done in 2012, says 68 to 108 billion US dollars every year needs to go into infrastructure to meet the basic infrastructure needs across the continent. That has not been updated, and it also doesn't include climate change costs. It also doesn't incorporate, for example, questions around digital infrastructure, which is obviously becoming more and more important. If we don't have digital infrastructure, Africans can't join this. And once you put that into even more detailed context, effectively Africa's most indebted country, or some of the most indebted countries, one of them that comes up is typically Angola. Angola has 73% of the population still don't have internet access. Now, if you're talking about debt and financing, what we must really avoid is thinking we need to stop money going into the country. That isn't the starting point. The starting point is, how can more money go into the country and into countries, but to deliver better, okay? So that's number one. Second of all, we also have to put, in terms of China's role, we first also need to think about where China came from in terms of what was the overall financial picture before China effectively turned up. And that picture is a really interesting one. That picture begins, there was a lot of overseas development assistance going into African nations from a range of different partners. From the 1990s, that had really kind of stabilized at around 50 billion a year to Africa. And it's kind of stayed about the same. It's not really increased much, it's not really decreased. But what has also happened is, of course, the economic situation of African countries has changed. So back in the 1990s, that kind of finance overall started off at making about 6% of the GDP of African countries. By the time we get to now, it's more like 3% or less in total. And that obviously there's great distribution across different countries. But just the declining role of support from other countries, including the multilateral organizations, in the context of growing economies, also creates a space. Now let's come to China. China's own space. How has China come in? That's the third point. Again, we have to look at the data. There is the country with the highest proportion, the African country is the highest proportion of Chinese debt as a proportion of GDP is Djibouti. That level is 39% of its GDP, okay? That is the top. Everyone else has less. I want to be very, very clear. Everybody else has less than that. So there are some countries for whom multilateral lending also makes up a large proportion of their finance. Some countries who can't get concessional loans anymore from the multilaterals because they have reached higher income levels. So private finance starts to make a higher proportion. And then, yes, there's also ones who have reached out to China, and China has agreed in terms of being a financer. So you get, for instance, Cabo Verde. China makes up 1% of GDP, Chinese loans. Ghana, 3%. So it really varies. It is not a single story, but it is also a limited story at 39%. Last but not least, is there a debt crisis? Is there a debt crisis because of China? Is there a debt crisis in general? Now, I know a lot of people out there, including some very, very important, highly respected, and I absolutely respect them myself, say that there's a debt crisis now. I don't agree with them. And I'll tell you why. First of all, we need to look at the data. And we need to really understand what the data is telling us. And the data just isn't there to tell us whether we're in a debt crisis in the way that some people claim. First of all, when you look at the African countries, there are 12 African countries that are currently, who have their GDP levels over 60%, debt to GDP levels over 60%, and they're classified as highly in debt distress or high at risk of debt distress by the IMF. Those countries were among 64 countries across the world who also have their 60%, that kind of 60% ratio. However, these are the only 12 countries, that are classified as in debt distress are African. That's it. Everyone else not actually classified as debt distressed, but they still have their debt to GDP ratios over 60%. So is there a debt? So that suggests that there is a specific debt crisis in Africa. But what is the evidence? What is the evidence for that? There are a few countries which one might suggest have been spending perhaps badly. they're definitely not going to the degree of what the debt crisis was back in the 1990s. You look at Zambia. Zambia's public debt to GDP ratio back in the 1990s was 244% of GDP. That, of course, required drastic action. There are no countries that are projected to go to that kind of level, even with what's going on with COVID-19 and with the amount of debt that they have taken out. So there's obviously, there are obviously certain concerns for certain countries about whether they can actually meet their debt repayments. That is particularly in order to meet debt repayments because of COVID-19, the challenge is countries are not collecting tax. They're not collecting economic revenue. The biggest crisis is an economic crisis around not being able to restart economies again. And it comes back to one of the points that Toby made earlier on, which is how are economies structured? They're not structured in a way that allows them to diversify, that they're able to still get revenues even if they are shut down or locked down. Their trade is very basic, raw materials. Tourism, many countries are highly dependent on tourism if they're not dependent on commodities. These are the challenges which are preventing African countries from being able to raise the revenue to then pay back the debt. It is not necessarily in terms of the overall debt to GDP ratios that really matter. So with those few points in mind, starting off with the need for more finance, the role of China within a global context of support to Africa, and then as a supporter, which is, yes, it matters, but it doesn't matter that much. And then the challenge that we have today, dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and how we move ahead. What do we do to move ahead? And how can China and others play, a helpful role to Africans? And how do Africans ourselves, how do we play a helpful role for ourselves? The first thing is definitely not to agree that there's a debt crisis. That isn't the right starting point. The right starting point is to say we need more finance now, more fiscal space now, and we need to work out how we get that fiscal space. And we also must be thinking about how do we create the right mechanisms to be able to raise better finance, cheaper finance, definitely, cheaper finance in order to meet our future needs going forward, whether that's from China, whether it's from the private sector, or whether it's from the multilaterals. And how can everybody start really racing to help to do that? I think those are the ways forward. And China is, a partner just like any others in doing that.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that useful overview. I think you highlighted a point that is very obvious, and yet it also gets lost a lot of the time, which is this debt stems from African need. China isn't pushing these loans on countries that don't want them. These countries want this money, and oftentimes China is the only provider. So thank you for highlighting that and bringing that useful data-based overview of the so-called debt crisis in Africa. Now we're going to turn to Bob for moving away from the hard numbers to a little bit more of the soft diplomacy that Toby was looking at a little bit in his remarks, the soft infrastructure. How is China trying to shape its public image, whether that's through media or diplomatic programming or exchanges, and how successful has it been in its image crafting in Africa?
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thanks for having me. Also, thanks colleagues Hannah and Toby. I think the topic indeed, as you framed it, is to look at China's public diplomacy and in Africa and its effectiveness. And I thought that being the topic, I will say, I'll use the framework of, if we are talking of effectiveness, there must be areas of ineffectiveness. So I think you always have to have two sides of a coin. And so I thought my presentation will look at the areas of effectiveness of Chinese public diplomacy and soft power, which you can also characterize as the success factors of China's public diplomacy, and soft power in Africa, and then move on to areas of ineffectiveness. Because as a scholar, I think we would like to believe that, and I think as Anna says, there's no single story. There are areas, and I think also as Toby said, there are areas of optimism, but we must also keep an eye on pessimism and also the middle ground. And like Hannah's presentation, I don't have hard numbers. I think that's the weak end of us in humanities, that we kind of rely on qualitative arguments. And when you give us numbers, we kind of want to run away very fast. And I think just a very glib understanding of public diplomacy is that it is an attempt at influencing foreign publics. And I think there's many other definitions and concepts and so forth. There's a huge discussion around the variances or differences of conception of public diplomacy in China and in the West and so forth. And I don't think I'll go into that. And essentially also just a shortcut in terms of describing soft power is actually that it is the image of a country in another country, or in this case, the image of China on a continent. And therefore, we can actually say that public diplomacy leads to either soft power or lack of it. Some people can actually then talk of hard power, but also I'll not want to go into the conceptual discussions. Now, launching straight into the areas of effectiveness or areas of success, I'll suppose that one of the key areas is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, as a key mechanism for engaging publics. In fact, you just want to look at the triennial, the 3-cycle process. We usually want to get in on the act, on the jamboree when there's the conference, but there's a lot that happens in between one conference and another. And therefore, it's not just a mechanism that has many eyeballs around the world looking at what's going on, but it's actually effective in the sense that there's all this big jamboree, but there's also things happening at the FOCAC Secretariat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and in coordination with the African ambassadors in China, which is really essentially engagement as public diplomacy. With ministries of foreign affairs, many African countries have China desks and so forth. So I think that the FOCAC is not only a mechanism, is not only a driver, but it's an exemplification of Chinese soft power. In fact, I think you can look at it as summitry or conference diplomacy that actually other regions of the world have gotten into the act on. The EU, started its own EU-Africa Summit, courtesy of that. The India-African Summit has gotten on. But I doubt that these have reached anywhere close to FOCAC. The US, the country that I study closely, attempted one in 2014, and that was just about it. There's been talk that perhaps the Biden administration will consider that, but I think we are not discussing the US here. I think the second one, which can actually be folded into FOCAC, is a BRI, Build and Road Initiative. And again, I think Toby did touch on that. And I think the clear engagement is actually begins to look like FOCAC, but on a global scale. And African countries, particularly on the Eastern Seaboard, are direct beneficiaries. But beyond just the infrastructure projects, you can actually see that the Chinese have actually gone out to do the communication around it, which is a form of public diplomacy. That you're not just going to build the SGR, the standard gauge railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, and not shout about it. I think you can, if you so wish, you could go to China Global Television Network, and you'll see quite a couple of documentaries. And I think for those of us who follow this bit, there's quite a lot there where you can see that it is the projection of Chinese assistance to Africa as a form of public diplomacy. I think one can go on and on about FOCAC and BRI, but I think let's move on to the other example, which is China as a model for Africa in terms of overcoming, poverty. The transformation of China over a relatively short period is actually held up as an example. And I think this is a narrative you hear on the streets. That means soft power. Or at least from the intellectual community, when you sit with people, they will tell you, no, look, we need to emulate the Chinese example. There's the whole area of rhetoric, or the language that is used. And I think Toby did touch on that quite a bit. I'll not want to bore you with the many terms, but all from new type of partnership, from win-win cooperation, from mutual benefit. It is a charm offensive, and this is not the kind of language you hear from the West. It's very unlikely. Even Obama, who had roots on the continent, did not quite lavish such praise. And I can just imagine, President Xi Jinping with Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, and here's Xi Jinping saying, look, you are the most effective leader in the world, and so forth. While at the same time, from Washington, the narrative is that you need to get out of power. You've been around for far too long, and so forth. So I think we can discuss all that as a matter of public diplomacy. I think African leaders, elites, appreciate the fact that they are treated with decorum and so forth. Obviously, from the other side, there's been denigration and so forth, and I do not need to touch on the S word that was used by former presidents of some place. I think one can then go on to they actually established mechanisms for engagement in terms of public diplomacy. I think Hanpan, which we know as the Confucius Institute, is now there. I think we have nearly 60 Confucius Institutes on the continent. Obviously, some countries have a lion's share. I think Kenya has about 6, South Africa has about 7, but they're quite well distributed around the continent. There is the whole area of provincial governments. I think this sometimes we forget that Chinese provincial governments engage directly, and there's trips that they trips for journalists, like training junkets into China. There's CSR emerging from provincial, companies allied or we are part of the provincial governments, and there are quite a good number of examples there. Increasingly, and I think this is an area of change, as I think both Hannah and Toby mentioned, the China-Africa relationship is not static, it's dynamic. Over the years, we've seen that while in the past, most of the public diplomacy effort was state-led, it was led by the government in Beijing. Increasingly, we see multinationals playing that role. And if you care to look around, just look at the corporate social responsibility work of Huawei, for example, training institutes in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya. You look at a company such as Alibaba, even though Jack Ma has had difficulties in recent times in the Middle Kingdom, but he started off this tenderpreneurship and a prize for the winning, person with the young person with good ideas. In fact, in partnership with UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and one can go on that. I think Toby did mention scholarships. I don't need to repeat that. There's that whole area of public diplomacy entities as an area of success. And I think we see in this particular area, the China Public Diplomacy Association, the China-Africa Friendship with Foreign People. I think when I studied in Beijing, we used to, being poor students, we used to look out for activities from the Chinese Association for Friendship with Foreign People, because every national day for any country, they will host a ball, an evening out there in central Beijing, and we'll be ready, because our friends from Nigeria or Ghana or Zambia will say, no, look, we are heading to, the Hilton, Beijing, and we'll come along, and it will have been sponsored by associations such as this. But also they provide quite an excellent mechanism for engagement. I think I think Toby did also mention the whole area of buildings, as an exemplar of soft power. And just about every African country now has a building or another. I think apart from South Africa, which is, still proud, saying, no, look, we have our own capabilities. Nearly, I will say, my guess is 40 plus countries do have one building or the other. And I think finally, in the present times, on the effectiveness point, I think China has done very well in handling the COVID-19 pandemic, in taming it, even though some people have said it used some ruthless tactics. Some African, when you listen to conversation, including in the groups in which I am, some have said actually we need those ruthless, approaches to containing, the truant and the terrible behavior. I think China did supply, PPEs, to contain the pandemic. And obviously, even though there was lots of some turbulence, there was an engagement at the level of the leadership. Wang Yi and President Xi Jinping reached out into, virtual events with African leaders. I think I ran very through the ineffectiveness or failure of public diplomacy and soft power very fast, knowing that my time is nearly over, amazingly. And I think one is to start with while the whole idea of rhetoric seems interesting, it has a flip side. And the flip side is that this language is too charming. It is just too gushing. The swooning is beyond comprehension. That's not how Africans, talk. You can't use words, win-win, mutual benefits, and so forth in one sentence and just feel comfortable. That it will be actually like you're masking something. That's one. Two, I think it will almost be automatic that there will be some failure in public diplomacy and soft power by the mere fact that China is the bigger power here. And Africans have dealt with big powers in the past. When you deal with a bigger power, you actually almost sometimes accept what they offer. And that weakness is actually a demonstration of lack of Chinese soft power. Anytime China, in fact, I think that speaks to what Hannah was saying, because China has grown very fast. Anything it does in Africa will be treated with suspicion. And while it might be true or not true, that's an instant of failure of soft power or ineffectiveness or low levels of soft power. I think the lack of engagement with African civil society is another area, but one also has to add on very quickly that the many civil society organizations on the continent have very close ties with their Western, counterparts. In fact, some of them are just extension of Western ones. They are extremely critical of this, and you see this in newspapers and talk shows and so forth. I think the other point of criticism is that China has focused more on what it calls economic rights rather than human rights. And that becomes problematic in countries where those are issues of concern. In terms of media, I see it as an area of ineffectiveness on two levels. The Western media has been very critical of China in Africa. Many of the Western media outlets, you talk of Reuters, you talk of AP, you talk of so forth, are the ones that supply news to African media outlets. And therefore, by default, this is the narrative that is evident in the independent newspaper in South Africa, or the Punch in Nigeria, or Daily Nation in Kenya, and so forth. But also the second point is that Chinese media that came onto the continent, Daily, China Daily, People's Daily, CGTN, China Global Television Network, Xinhua News Agency, have not been very successful in penetrating that market. And I will suggest it's because their narrative is too, again, gushing, with no room for criticism of China. And that's not just the media appetite on the continent. That's, I think, an instance of failure. Perhaps the only entity that seems to be doing well is Star Times, and that is courtesy of their pay TV end of things, which is far cheaper than the dominant player on the continent called MultiChoice. And of course, I think the issue of data diplomacy has been discussed. The issue of cyber espionage was discussed by Toby, and I'll not go back to that. But finally, I think one has to look at COVID-19 and the failure of Chinese public diplomacy. One, because essentially this virus was eventually referred to as the Ohana Virus, and the joke around the continent, if you look at the banter, has been that, yeah, indeed, it's a Ohana virus. In fact, there are so many conspiracy narratives around it, and that's an instance of failure. And then obviously, in terms of the Guangzhou controversies, whether it was right, I know it has been explained, but the thing was that there was an attack on African, full stop. Let's not discuss anything else. But that actually also links to what many scholars have discussed in the past, that while elites in China have very good relations with the elites in Africa, the so-called downstairs relationship, the lower levels, actually is usually problematic. And it's sometimes because the feeling is that the Chinese people do not actually see the value of close relations, neither do Africans. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Bob. Again, you covered a lot of ground in a short time, so I appreciate that. So we're going to get to our question and answer session in the time that we have remaining. And to start out, I just wanted to jump off of Bob's ending point, which is something that Toby also discussed a little bit in his remarks. There's a difference between elite perceptions of China in African countries and public perceptions of China. You might have a case where the government has a very good relationship and a very rosy outlook on China, and maybe the average person on the street does not. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more, and particularly the question, is this a problem for China? Because cynically, you can imagine that in a country where there's not as much democracy and not as much space for the public to have their say, it might not be an issue. So maybe Toby, did you want to start with this, and we can move on if Hannah or Bob have anything to add?
Yes, I think, of course, the public, the non-state actors can be a problem in the sense that they are not attached with the same kind of baggage that the political elites have. You need to get funding, development funding from China. So there's a limit to your criticism. In fact, a very recent example was, the maltreatment of Africans, and how the Nigerian government versus, the public handled that situation. The government and the public were at one point on the same page. They were critical. But after, China, they've discussed with the Nigerian government started softening its tone that, I think there was a mistake somewhere, I think. But what happened? The public, the non-state actors, the media groups started putting the government on pressure. The government had to correct itself, invite the Chinese ambassador to also criticize, things that we never seen before, in a government, a top government official inviting a Chinese diplomat to criticize him, and publicly that was recorded and posted online for the world to see. That never happened. The point, and I think I talked about this some years ago, where I talked about the points of disengagement and points of engagement. You see governments, African governments, that don't want to be critical with China because they need to get, this funding for infrastructure and for every other thing. But you have an enlightened public that is also watching this relationship, whether it is in terms of labor relations, where Chinese companies, do certain things that is anti the labor laws of the country. The government is silent. The institutions are relatively silent. But you get non-state actors drawing attention to this, whether it is the media, whether it is labor unions, talking about these things. So yes, I think it can be a problem. But I think also that China is also learning in the sense that, unlike before, when China is, and I think Bob talked about it, when China is, it used to be this state-state relationship. They are also beginning to understand the importance of the people-to-people relationship. And let me share some interesting things that is happening on the continent. If you come to my university, for instance, my university in the next few years, the building is already almost completed. My university would have one of the biggest libraries, and think about it, one of the biggest libraries in the country, and it is being built by China. I get, project students working on that and analyzing students' perception, which was for me, very interesting. It's not only a Nigerian problem. In Ghana, for instance, the University of Health and Allied Sciences is being built from scratch to the end by China. One of the most beautiful libraries, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, beautiful. I was thinking my university library was the best, you know. But when I went to Dar es Salaam, the new library, the university library was spectacular. Guess what? It is being built by China. So imagine students that know that, you know, this is not about road infrastructure or, you know, stadium diplomacy and the rest of it. But this is where I go on a daily basis to read and learn. And it is being built by China. You know, so things like that, those are very symbolic things. But of course, they also have the way of, people go away with such kind of sentiment that, oh, this and things like that. So I think China is, of course, the Confucius Institute trying to, you know, do a lot of cultural events to bring people together so that at the level of the state, the relationship is relatively, you know, positive. But the people to people, China is also interested in that. And I think China is also focusing on that. I'll leave Anna and Bob to probably also.
Okay, Hannah or Bob, either of you want to chime in?
I can chime in, and very quickly, I think just in a couple of, like in a minute or so, to just add on to what Tony is saying, it is that it's actually complicated, the so-called downstairs and upstairs perspective. And I think some scholars have pointed out that the sentiments from the African continent are not uniformly negative or uniformly positive. They can turn positive or optimistic on issues to do with the economic development, the building of what, you know, what Tobias said, you know, the construction, be it roads, ports, buildings of whatever nature, you know, building of undersea cables and developing ICT infrastructure and so forth. And they can actually then turn sour if, for example, a Chinese entity is aiding a country such as Zambia or Ethiopia in surveillance, in surveilling its citizens via internet approaches, which now tends towards the human rights and democracy issues. And this actually can actually be one African, not we are not even saying one person can have those sentiments. In fact, you know, that nuanced approach where one person says, by the way, I like Chinese, you know, positive contribution to Africa's economic development, but I do not necessarily like their, you know, involvement with us on the government front. That would be my addition. Thank you.
Yeah, let me add a very, very small point. So one of the things that we really advocate, you know, as a firm working on these issues, and we see there's a real gap is in terms of governments explaining what their strategy is with regards to China. Now, you know, my previous point was, you know, China is an important actor, is becoming more and more important on the continent. And because there is a multitude of ways in which it's possible to engage Chinese stakeholders, from getting, you know, Chinese firm to build a new road or library, even if it's self-financed, it doesn't even have to be Chinese financed. It can be also financed by the multilaterals. From also then, you know, kind of gifts of aid, sorting out humanitarian assistance, medical teams, etc. There's so many different facets to Chinese engagement. And what we don't see still, and we've been saying this for years, is we don't see African countries that really, and governments that really have a handle on what does this full picture actually look like, and where do we want it to go? What do we want, and explaining that to citizens so that it then becomes something which is actually easy to understand. You know, we're trying to increase our trade balance. That's our main goal. You know, even just a simple point like that would be very helpful, and we do really try and encourage governments to do that. It will help.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, but we'll squeeze in one more question from the audience. This is from James Hammersley. He says, one of the EU's main strategic challenges is dealing with migration from Africa. Has there been any cooperation by the EU with China in providing critical finance for the development of Africa? So looking at this in the terms of trilateral cooperation, where the EU is partnering with China to try and address some of the same issues. Are we seeing any of that? I don't know if Hannah, maybe you want to start here since this is dealing with the finance issue.
Yeah, I'll come in there, and I'm sure Bob and Toby will also want to say something on it. So in the past, the idea of trilateral cooperation has been there. Many African governments have been quite suspicious of what that is, in the sense of are other governments trying to influence China to move into a different sphere, to actually reduce the finance to us, try to influence in a direction that we don't want it to go, really to take, in a sense, take control of our relationship with China. And that's not what African governments want, of course. So there has been some suspicion of it. At the same time, Chinese government has been saying that it's more open. African governments have been indicating openness a bit more, and especially with regards to the UN. So a lot of what is happening now, and I don't know, some people will know that a white paper came out recently from China, a new white paper on international development. And that said, it had a very clear kind of direction saying we are open to trilateral cooperation, but in particular with international organizations, and meaning the UN really being involved as much as possible. So this seems to be the way that China wants to deal with that, given the concerns from the African side. But I think there is possibility for more. And there is a possibility, in specific areas where there, I think part of the problem is the European approach and the Chinese approach really do differ hugely in terms of what their idea of financing and support for Africa is. James mentioned dealing with migration. That's very reactive. It's not really about development. It's not really about investing in the continent. It's a completely different kind of what we call in international development theory of change. Very, very different. So if you have trilateral cooperation, how do you get across that? And in many ways, what many African governments certainly want is to move away from the idea of reactive aid towards something which is a lot more holistic, much more investing. There's talk about something called global public investment, investing in Africa's development, investing in things like trade value addition, in the Continental Free Trade Agreement, in infrastructure as well, and doing much more of that, which is what China has started to do as well. But there could be some future scope for doing more of that. But it also depends on Europe changing its way of dealing with Africa in some ways.
Right. Maybe I can add very quickly that I do agree with the entry point that Hannah made. In fact, what it is that there have been quite a few attempts. If you look at the literature, not even just from recently, from the 90s, and the standard, almost standard response by Africans has been that you are now looking at a situation where Africans and the Europeans want to gang up on us. The Africans are like, no, look, we are comfortable dealing with all of you separately. We do not want you to come into coalition and so forth. And in fact, it has always been said that, no, look, if there's anything that is joined and so forth, let it operate at the UN level. And I know Hannah will know a lot of this, having been with the UNDP in the past. And therefore, this concept of a trilateral arrangement on Africa has not quite flown. I think I do recall, in fact, on the African continent, the two European countries that have really pushed for the trilateral approach have been Germany. I think there was a push when Angela Merkel was just new in a leadership position, and also France, courtesy of its so-called satellite states in West Africa and parts of Central Africa. But I think that has been resisted, and I suppose without the agreement of African countries, it's not going to fly. Thanks.
I think I'll just make very, very short, comments. The history of NEPAD, tells us quickly that this idea of trilateral relationship is difficult because of what Anna talked about, the ideological, underpinning of what development means for the West, Europe and China is difficult to really marry. But, I'm actually a little bit optimistic at some level, and that level is probably at the level of COVID, for instance. Last year, when China, was about breaking the ground for the new Africa CDC, the Trump administration said it was going to stop funding the African CDC because China was going to be building the new secretariat. But you know what? The EU was still interested in going forward, in still supporting. So of course, we don't know what the Biden administration will do. But if the EU continues with that plan, of course, that could be, a kind of seed that may help the players, learn to, trust themselves. And I think I would just end with what a colleague, said recently, that Africa, we have our problems. We don't want Africa to be, the arena where EU, China, US compete. We need the support of both of them. If it is going to be mutual, if it is going to be, done together, fine. If they can't do it together, of course they can do it separately, but we need as much support as we can get from all of them.
Well, I'm sure we could talk for hours more, but unfortunately, that's all the time we had blocked out for today. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for joining us from all over the world, Toby, Hannah, and Bob. Thank you for an enlightening discussion on China-Africa relations. Thank you to our audience for joining in, and I hope to see you all on another day for our next webinar.